My name is Arlo Merrick, and if someone told me that my 38th birthday would detonate my life while handing me a crown, I wouldn't have believed them. We held the celebration at the Merrick family vineyard in Santa Rosa, a place carved into memory by long summers and wine-stained dusk. It was a spectacle, sunset casting gold over the hills, string quartets under the pergola, and socialites balancing flutes of sparkling rose like they were born to do nothing else. Camille wore a pale blue gown that shimmered with every step, a practiced smile stretched across her lips, and the Voss family, her parents Gerald and Maureen, and her ever-arrogant brother Bryce, circulated like royalty through the guests. I stood in the background for most of it, sipping my drink and watching from a safe distance, as I had learned to do over the years. Then, just before the cake, my grandfather, Silas Merrick, stepped forward with his usual measured grace. The murmur of the crowd quieted. The string quartet softened. Everyone turned, because when Silas Merrick speaks, people still listen. He held a black velvet box in one hand and a white envelope in the other. I've lived long enough to know that birthdays are less about cake and more about clarity, he said. So, Arlo, here's mine for you. Inside the envelope was a legal document bearing the Merrick Tech seal. My name was at the top, followed by a string of clauses that blurred before my eyes. Then I saw the line, transfer of controlling interest, 70%. I blinked. My chest tightened. The room didn't erupt in applause. There was confusion, hushed murmurs. A few polite claps. Camille froze, eyes darting to her parents. Bryce's whiskey glass stopped midair. Majority control of a $75 million company. Just like that. Silas smiled at me as if we had rehearsed it, though we never had. My hands trembled slightly as I held the papers. Thank you, I managed, voice low, trying not to betray how completely unprepared I was for the storm that was already forming in the corners of that picture-perfect evening. Camille leaned in close later as we posed for a photo. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered between clenched teeth. I smiled for the camera. Because it was a surprise for both of us. But the real surprise wasn't the gift. It was what followed. The guests dwindled. The catering crew began clearing champagne flutes and dessert forks. The laughter grew thinner, replaced by the rustle of evening wine through vineyard leaves. I was still reeling, seated in a half-lit lounge with my tie undone and two buttons open, when the Voss family gathered like a tribunal. Bryce slouched on the armrest, swirling his drink, that smug curl at the edge of his mouth already forming. Maureen stood like a woman ready to deliver a prepared statement. Gerald said nothing. He never did. Camille sat, carefully neutral, like someone afraid to spill something expensive. I assume, Maureen began, you understand that such a transition creates instability. For the shareholders, the board, public image. Which is why we think, she gestured gracefully toward Bryce, it would be best if Bryce steps in as the interim CEO. Just until the dust settles. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity hung so thick it felt like a joke. Bryce doesn't even know what Merrick Tech builds, I said. He still thinks our flagship software is called Mercury. It's Meridian. Bryce sat up. I know what's important, he said. Optics. Investor trust. Presence. And you think you represent stability? I said, standing now. Your last venture was a boutique gym that folded in 6 months. Camille looked at her hands. Maureen didn't blink. If you're going to be stubborn, she said, then I suggest you pack your bags and leave my daughter's life. We've tolerated your place at the table long enough. Her words were precise. Brutal. Like scalpels. And then, from the top of the staircase, a slow clap echoed. Silas. He descended with the patience of a man who'd seen decades of corporate boardrooms and backroom deals. You always did know how to twist a knife, Maureen, he said with a smile. But Arlo isn't leaving. Not unless he chooses to. In fact, I think now's the perfect time to share the second part of his birthday gift. The room shifted. Maureen frowned. Bryce's glass hit the side table with a thud. Camille looked like she wanted to disappear into the cushions. Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out a second envelope. This one's a bit more dramatic, he said, handing it to me. I opened it. Inside was a signed amendment dated 3 months ago. It reaffirmed not only my controlling stake, but attached a condition. Any attempt to remove me from executive leadership would require a unanimous board vote, including his. It was airtight. Final. No games, Silas said, his voice soft but lined with steel. You want the company, you go build your own. Bryce stood up. You can't do this. I just did. Camille stood too, her voice cracking. This isn't what we agreed to. I turned to her slowly. We? The room thickened with silence. No one said a word. Maureen's mask slipped just for a second, her lips twitching with rage. Gerald walked out quietly, perhaps realizing there were no more cards to play. Silas chuckled again and patted my shoulder. Happy birthday, Arlo. Now let's see what you do with the kingdom no one wanted you to have. And just like that, the lines were drawn, not in sand, but in stone. I hadn't grown up with anything close to wealth. After my parents died in a car accident when I was 14, the world shrank to the size of my grandfather's two-bedroom home in Petaluma. Grief had aged him even before the funeral, but somehow, he made space for me. He was already retired then, a man who'd built Merrick Tech from his garage, whose eyes still scanned newsprint, and whose mind never stopped running at full tilt. We didn't have much, but what we had was ours. He gave me room to be messy with my sorrow, firm when I needed direction, and always relentless when it came to learning. You're allowed to feel it, he once said, but you're not allowed to quit. Every summer from age 15 on, I worked at Merrick Tech, not because I had to, but because I wanted to be near the hum of it. While other teenagers clocked in at fast food joints, I was debugging software in the R&D lab, running test cases, and getting chewed out by engineers who didn't care that I was the founder's grandson. I loved it. Not just the code, but the rhythm, the grit. Late nights with vending machine dinners, coffee that tasted like old socks, and whiteboards scribbled with equations that barely made sense until they suddenly did. I earned every scrap of respect I got. And Grandpa made sure I knew that legacy wasn't inherited, it was earned, line by line. When I met Camille in college, she was drawn to that ambition. She said I had an engine under the hood. We met in an advanced data systems course. She wasn't even in the class, just wandered in one day because her roommate said there were cute nerds inside. Camille was smart, striking confident. She wore certainty like perfume. The daughter of wealth, yes, but she never flaunted it, not at first. She said she liked that I was different, grounded, unapologetically obsessed with building something that mattered. We talked about dreams, about impact. She said she wanted more than brunches and designer hand-me-downs. She wanted fire. I thought I was that fire. But marrying her meant stepping into a world I never fully belonged to. Her parents tolerated me when my startup salary hit 6 figures. They smiled at dinners, posed for photos at holidays. But the way Gerald said my name, always like it was missing a prefix. The way Maureen looked at me like I was the before photo in some makeover campaign. Even at our wedding, Bryce stood beside her like a placeholder for the kind of man they thought she should have chosen. It didn't matter how much I succeeded. I was still Arlo from Petaluma, the boy with scuffed shoes and calloused hands. A placeholder. A phase. Bryce, on the other hand, was the golden son. Never mind that he left a trail of failed ventures and unfulfilled promises. He always had their backing. When his gym franchise went belly up, Maureen's firm absorbed the financial fallout. When he crashed his third car, Gerald wrote it off as a learning experience. He'd never had to crawl out of a pit. He didn't know what it meant to rebuild with bleeding hands. But he looked the part, square jaw, expensive watch, effortless charm, and that was enough for their world. In that world, perception outweighed reality. Optics were everything. That night, after the birthday party turned battlefield, Camille didn't speak to me. She retreated to the guest room with her phone and her silence. I stayed downstairs, pacing the living room where the smell of Chardonnay still clung to the curtains. I replayed everything Maureen had said, every word laced with arrogance and entitlement. And Bryce, lounging like he was already king. Camille hadn't stood up for me. Not once. Not even when Maureen told me to leave her life. That wasn't silence, that was consent. Around midnight, I slipped into my grandfather's study. The door creaked open like it knew what I was carrying. Silas sat in his chair with a chessboard in front of him, unmoved since early that evening. He looked up, eyes alert, fingers still curled around a whiskey glass. They're coming harder than I thought, I said. He took a slow sip. They've had decades to rehearse their entitlement. Of course they are. I walked over, letting the quiet stretch between us. Finally, I asked, did you know they'd come for it this fast? Silas leaned back. I didn't give you the company because I thought they wouldn't. I gave it to you because I knew you'd be ready when they did. I sat across from him, watching the board. I had once asked him why he loved chess so much. He said, because every piece has its power, but only one survives. They think I'm bluffing, I muttered. Silas gave a tired smile. They think they're playing poker. We're playing strategy. I stayed down there most of the night. Thinking. Planning. I knew now I'd never truly been welcome in Camille's world. I'd been convenient. Palatable. Easier to parade around than challenge. But I wasn't just a son-in-law anymore. I was the majority shareholder of Merrick Tech. That terrified them. Not just because of the power shift, but because it shattered the illusion that they were in control. They wanted me to roll over, to hand the keys to Bryce and walk out grateful for the ride. But I built my life brick by brick, without shortcuts or allowances. I wasn't handing anything over. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask, was that Grandpa and I had spent years preparing for this exact scenario. Documents, access protocols, legal safeties buried in bylaws. Systems only 2 people in the world truly understood. That house, that vineyard, that smiling crowd. They were all camouflage. What mattered was still mine. Because what they failed to understand was this: you don't kick out someone who was never trying to sit at your table. You forget him, until the day he builds a bigger one, and invites everyone but you. By the time the sun peeled its way across the vineyard hills the next morning, I was already dressed in slate gray slacks and a blazer that didn't quite match, wrinkled from the night I barely slept. I didn't bother waking Camille. There was nothing left to say. The house still smelled like old roses and sugar from the party, a reminder that celebration had turned to war in less than 12 hours. I drove to Merrick Tech in silence. No music, no podcasts. Just the hum of the engine and my thoughts sorting themselves into a grid of actions and consequences. The headquarters sat just outside Palo Alto, a sleek building with glass walls that reflected the sky, so cleanly it made it hard to believe anything ugly could happen inside. I parked in my usual reserved spot, but when I held my key card to the reader, the scanner blinked red. Access denied. I tried again. Red. A guard approached, apologetic but firm. Mr. Merrick, I was instructed to escort you to the front desk. I knew right then. Bryce had wasted no time. My mouth tightened as I followed the guard inside. The lobby still displayed the Merrick Tech mission statement in steel-cut letters on the wall. Build for the future. Think past the now. A mission I'd helped write. At the desk, the receptionist, a new hire I barely knew, looked nervous. Your credentials were revoked this morning. I was told to inform you that all communication should go through legal. Was Bryce here? I asked flatly. She nodded. With Camille. Around 6:30 a.m. Of course. Bryce never had the discipline for early mornings. This wasn't about work. It was about dominance. A move on the chessboard made while the other player slept. But I didn't panic. I asked to use the visitor computer in the conference lounge, and after a little persuasion, and the fact that my name was still technically above the building entrance, I logged in using a legacy admin credential. One of the back doors Grandpa and I had quietly preserved over the years. Nothing illegal. Just undocumented. Because when you build the foundation, you always leave a hidden door for yourself. First, I checked my email. Disabled. Second, I accessed our internal project repository. My heart rate spiked. Several core folders, engine files, patent drafts, and schematic data were missing. Entire sections of our proprietary Lighthouse codebase had been purged. Not archived. Not moved. Deleted. Bryce hadn't come to manage the company. He came to sabotage it. I picked up my phone and called Dr. Renata Quill. She answered on the second ring. Arlo, I need you to meet me in sublevel 3. Now, Renata had been with the company almost as long as I had. Head of R&D. A genius in sustainable systems. Grandpa loved her like a niece, and I trusted her with every prototype before the board even saw a sketch. She didn't ask questions. She said she'd be there in 20 minutes. Sublevel 3 wasn't connected to the primary elevators. You had to enter through the old freight system near the loading dock, a remnant from the company's original hardware days. It was mostly in use now, except for storage and some long-term archives. She arrived with her hair tied back and an old Merrick Tech hoodie over her blouse. What's going on? She asked as I ushered her into one of the unused DevOps rooms. They gutted my access, I said. And they're deleting files. Important ones. Jesus. Do you know who? I do now. I need you to check the server logs. Anything tied to admin accounts in the last 48 hours. Especially overrides. Renata opened her laptop and plugged into the hard line. While she typed, I paced. I didn't know what would hit harder, that Bryce had the gall to do this, or that Camille had come with him. That she walked into a company I helped build and gave her brother keys to everything. The betrayal didn't even sting at this point. It just crystallized something I'd long suspected. I had mistaken proximity for loyalty. Renata's fingers paused. Got something. There was an admin override created under temporary credential ID, BVOS_temp_2. Bryce, I muttered. Of course. She scrolled. Multiple deletions from the Lighthouse directory. And look at this. There's a flagged external transfer attempt. Last night, timestamp 2:12 a.m. External to who? Renata frowned and opened the metadata packet. Encrypted outbound transfer, routed through a masked relay. I leaned in. Can you trace it? Not directly, but there's a breadcrumb. Whoever did it wasn't careful. They left a shell log in the purge directory. She tapped a few more keys and pulled up a file name. Nadari_consult_memo final. I froze. Did you say Nadari? She looked up. You know him? Kareem Nadari, the corporate butcher. He acquires, strips, sells, leaves nothing behind. You only deal with him if you're desperate or if you plan to walk away with cash while the building burns. Renata paled. You think Bryce is selling? I nodded slowly. He never wanted to run Merrick Tech. He wanted to liquidate it. Renata sat back, stunned. How long do you think they've been planning this? Long enough to convince Camille to co-sign and to lock me out before sunrise. I felt rage rise in my throat, but I swallowed it. I didn't have time for rage. I needed clarity. I needed documentation. Renata, I said, start copying every log, every metadata chain. Back it up, off-network. Use the old systems Grandpa left in the sub-basement. She nodded, already moving. They want to gut Merrick Tech, I said. But they forgot one thing. What's that? She asked, glancing at me over the screen. I smiled, cold and sharp. I helped build the backbone. I know where the arteries are. As I walked out of sublevel 3, one truth became blindingly clear. This wasn't just a power grab. This was a digital coup. And they were about to learn what happens when the man they tried to erase becomes the firewall. I sat in the parking lot of Merrick Tech with the driver's side window cracked, the late morning breeze offering little comfort against the burn in my chest. What I'd seen in that server, what Renata uncovered, wasn't just about power. It wasn't about Bryce trying to prove himself or Camille wanting control. This was about escape. Desperation. A drowning man reaching for a raft made from someone else's spine. And that raft was Merrick Tech. By the time I returned to the estate that evening, I had a plan forming, but it was brittle. I needed to know the why behind Bryce's betrayal. Why sell the company? Why risk exposure? What did he stand to gain? I wasn't inside the house 10 minutes before Gerald cornered me in the hallway. He smelled like old cologne and entitlement. You're causing unrest, he said, like I was a virus. Think of the shareholders. Think of Camille. I have. And Camille's silence said enough. I pushed past him. He muttered something, but I didn't care. I went straight to the office Camille and I had once shared. The double doors were open. Her laptop sat on the desk, screen still glowing. I stood there for a moment, torn between decency and necessity. Then I stepped in. I knew her passwords. Of course I did. We'd shared everything once. Her logins hadn't changed. The moment I opened her files, a sick chill ran down my spine. There it was. The memo. Nadari's name. A proposed acquisition structure. Confidential incentives. And at the top, a signature line already filled out, Bryce's digital sign-off, with Camille CC'd on every document. They had already drafted the sale. I clicked through the folders. Camille had notes about post-sale branding options and foundational asset liquidation phases. Every line was cold, transactional, efficient. It was like reading a eulogy for a living company. But the part that hit hardest wasn't business. It was personal. I found a PDF scanned correspondence. A private note from Nadari's legal team that said, as long as Mr. Voss can deliver controlling interest, the debt will be cleared. Debt? My stomach turned. I called Renata again and told her to run a background scan on Bryce, not just personal, but financial. 2 hours later, I had the results. And they weren't just damning. They were radioactive. Bryce was $4.3 million in debt across multiple fronts, private loans, gambling IOUs, asset liens. All of it hidden under shell accounts and fake investment funds. And one name kept appearing in the payment trails. Kareem Nadari. Bryce had borrowed from him, likely through intermediaries, gambling most of it away. What remained, he'd promised to pay back with something far more valuable than cash, Merrick Tech. And Camille? She knew. She wasn't just aware. She was involved. Renata found more emails, ones where Camille advised Bryce on how to stabilize investor confidence during the transition. She even suggested I be removed quietly. Frame it as stress-related, she wrote. He won't fight if he feels ashamed. I read that line 3 times. Then I laughed, but it sounded more like a growl. I'd built that company with the calluses on my palms. I had spent my 20s sleeping in server rooms, eating ramen, while Camille sipped cocktails with interns turned executives. I sacrificed everything for the company and for her, and she was advising her brother to gaslight me into surrender. But I didn't feel broken. I felt electrified. This was the missing piece. Bryce wasn't just greedy. He was trapped. Nadari had him cornered. The only way out was to hand over something Nadari couldn't buy, Merrick Tech. And they thought I'd step aside quietly. I drove back to Renata's lab that night. She was still there, still backing up server logs onto isolated drives. I want to bury them, I said, stepping inside. Not just survive this. I want them blacklisted, discredited, and gasping for relevance. She closed the laptop and looked up. Then we hit them where it hurts, credibility and legality. We outlined a plan. First, we'd secure legal standing. Grandpa's legacy clause protected us from any sale or liquidation attempt without 96% approval. Between his 26% and my 70%, we had exactly that. Bryce's deal with Nadari was already void on impact. Second, we'd exposed the breach, the unauthorized admin access, the purge files, and the attempted data transfer. We had logs, server trails, and credential timestamps. That covered digital malpractice. Third, the motive, Bryce's debt and Nadari's pressure, had a financial paper trail. It painted Bryce not as a visionary, but as a man trying to pay off dirty money with stolen assets. And Camille? Her emails, her signatures, her silence, they were damning. She could spin it however she wanted, but truth had a heartbeat, and it was louder than ever. I sat back and watched as Renata uploaded the secured files to a cold server. We're ready, she said. I nodded, exhaling. We set the meeting. Board, I said. And bring an extra chair. She smirked. For Bryce. No, I said. For the ghost of what they thought they could get away with. That night, I didn't return to the estate. I booked a room at an old boutique hotel downtown, one I used to walk by when I was broke and dreaming. I sat by the window with a glass of scotch and watched the lights of Silicon Valley flicker like a constellation of promises, some kept, most broken. I thought about my grandfather, about the sacrifices he made and the blood he poured into that company. He didn't raise me to inherit power. He raised me to protect it. And now I finally understood the full weight of what that meant. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. And Bryce and Camille had no idea how much they'd already lost. The morning I drove back to my grandfather's house, the sky hung low and gray, the clouds thick like they were holding their breath. A perfect fit, I thought. I wasn't there for comfort. I wasn't even sure I was there for clarity. I just needed the one person who could look me in the eye and tell me I wasn't insane for thinking my own wife had plotted my professional execution. I found Grandpa Silas exactly where I expected him to be, on the porch, blanket across his knees, his old hound curled at his feet. He wasn't the man he used to be, not physically, but there was still steel in his gaze. That quiet intelligence hadn't dulled with age, only sharpened. He looked up as I approached, not smiling, but not surprised either. You look like a man who just saw the inside of hell, he said. I brought a souvenir, I replied, handing him a thick envelope. Printouts of Camille's emails, Bryce's financial records, Nadari's contract drafts. I sat down across from him and waited. He flipped through each page without a word, pausing only once to pull a pair of glasses from his cardigan pocket. His expression didn't change, but I noticed the tightening of his jaw, the way his thumb pressed just a bit harder on the paper. After 5 minutes, he set the file down on the side table and exhaled, a deep, tired sound. I expected betrayal, he said simply. But not from your wife. That's on me. That line hit harder than anything I'd read in the documents. He said it with the weight of a man who had trusted too much and had hoped the next generation would be better. I realized then that this wasn't just about corporate sabotage. This was personal for him too. I should have seen it coming, I said. She never defended me. Not once. Not when they mocked me at dinners, not when Bryce laughed at my ideas in front of investors. I thought she was just avoiding conflict. Turns out she was laying groundwork. Silas nodded slowly. People like the Voss family, they don't fight with fists. They fight with whispers and contracts. You think they're playing chess, but they're busy carving the board from under you. I leaned forward. What if I told you they were planning to sell to Nadari? Not manage, not grow, just sell. Liquidate Merrick Tech and walk away with their cut. I'd say they're fools, he replied. Because they didn't read the fine print. He stood slowly, joints creaking, and walked back inside. I followed him into his study, a place that smelled like cedar and dust, every shelf packed with leather-bound ledgers, old prototypes, and artifacts of a life spent building. He opened a drawer and pulled out a black binder, thick and frayed at the corners. I knew what it was before he even laid it on the table. The original Merrick Tech Charter. He flipped it open to a page marked with a red ribbon and pointed. There, beneath a 1998 addendum, was a clause I hadn't known existed, not in this exact form. No sale, transfer, or liquidation of Merrick core divisions shall proceed without 96% shareholder approval. Exceptions null and void regardless of board majority. My breath caught. Between his 26% and my 70%, we controlled 96%. Bryce's deal wasn't just immoral. It was legally impossible. They never asked the right questions, Silas said, his voice like gravel. They assumed the company could be taken like a trinket. But I built Merrick Tech to survive vultures like Nadari and jackhawls like Bryce. I stared at the clause for a long time. It was so simple, so clean. A single paragraph that undid months, maybe years, of plotting. I looked up. I don't just want to block the sale. I want to make sure they understand why they lost. Silas smiled faintly. Then let's do it properly. We drafted letters. Not emails. Not phone calls. Letters. Real paper, thick stock, embossed with the Merrick seal. One for the board. One for the legal team. One addressed directly to Bryce, outlining the breach, the clause, and the potential consequences should he pursue any further action. And one for Camille. I wrote that one by hand. Camille, you stood beside me when I had nothing. You said you believed in my vision. In us. But belief without loyalty is nothing. You watched your brother try to burn down everything I built. And you handed him the match. This letter isn't a goodbye. That came the moment you co-signed a deal with a man who guts companies for sport. This is just the part where I stopped pretending not to see what's right in front of me. Arlo, it wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. But it would cut. Because she'd know exactly what it meant to be spoken to in cold truth by someone who used to hold her dreams in his hands. Once the letters were stamped and sealed, I stood on the porch beside Grandpa as the courier pulled away. He placed a hand on my shoulder. You're doing the right thing, he said. I know, I replied. I just wish it didn't have to feel like setting fire to a past I still remember loving. He looked at me then, sharp as ever. Sometimes the past has termites in its beams, and you don't find out until the whole damn thing creaks in the wind. That doesn't mean it wasn't a home. It just means it's time to rebuild. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun break through the clouds and thin, golden ribbons across the trees. I thought about everything still ahead, the board meeting, the evidence, the confrontation. And I felt ready, not because I was hardened, but because I finally understood. They tried to rewrite my story in ink that bled greed. But I had something stronger. Legacy, not as inheritance, but as armor. And a pen of my own. The morning of the emergency board meeting arrived with a quiet that didn't belong to corporate warfare. No alarms, no thunder, just a fog that settled over the Merrick Tech campus like a veil. I dressed in a dark navy suit, the same one I wore to Camille's last charity gala, the irony not lost on me, and slipped the envelope of evidence into my leather folio. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I just moved, deliberate and silent, like someone who'd already buried the worst of the pain and now had work to do. The boardroom sat on the 21st floor, all glass and mahogany and views of a city too distracted to notice the battles unfolding behind those pristine windows. Renata was already there, seated at the far end, her laptop open, eyes calm but alert. She gave me a nod, and I returned it. No words needed. We knew what today was. Not just a meeting, a reckoning. The Voss family arrived together, of course. Camille wore a cream blazer over a steel gray blouse, her expression carefully composed, just enough worry to look concerned, not enough to seem guilty. Bryce swaggered in next, wearing a brand-new navy suit with thin pinstripes, the kind he probably picked out to look executive. He made a show of greeting the board members individually, shaking hands, smiling with that practiced PR charm that meant nothing in the room we'd built with sweat and late nights. Maureen followed close behind, clipboard in hand, pearl necklace gleaming like it was part of her battle armor. They came in as a unit, clearly prepared to present a united front, clean, polished, and poised to spin. The board members sat quietly, uncertain. They were seasoned professionals. Some legacy appointments, others chosen for strategic diversity, but they weren't used to this kind of drama. Merrick Tech wasn't the type of company that showed up in tabloids. We solved problems. We built clean energy solutions. We weren't supposed to fracture like a soap opera. Bryce stood first. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the tension in this room, he said with an earnestness so artificial it practically dripped. There's been some confusion over leadership transitions and strategic direction. I want to assure everyone that my only goal is stability for our investors, our partners, and the brand. He paced a little, hands spread. As you know, recent decisions made regarding company control have raised concerns. I believe that appointing myself as interim CEO while things are clarified can provide the confidence our stakeholders need. He glanced at Camille, who nodded as if she were just an observer, not the co-architect of the attempted heist. Maureen spoke next, voice smooth as ever. We are not disputing Arlo's contributions, she said, but this is about responsible stewardship. Our analysts agree that a transition would help ensure smoother operations, especially as we entertain foreign investment opportunities. The phrase hung in the air, foreign investment. They didn't dare say Nadari's name. Not yet. I waited for the room to settle, then stood. Let's not waste time, I said. This isn't about stability. It's about sabotage. I opened my folio and began passing out packets, printed evidence for each board member. No screens. No digital projection. Just hard paper. A physical weight for the lies they tried to digitize into silence. The room went quiet as pages turned. I watched their eyes scan lines that couldn't be explained away. Logs of deleted project files traced to Bryce's temporary admin ID. Email exchanges with Nadari's legal team. A full financial analysis of Bryce's debt and the terms of his backdoor deal with a corporate butcher who'd never once left a company intact. Then I turned toward Camille. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And these, I said, sliding another page across the table, are screenshots of private text exchanges between Bryce and Camille. Here's one dated 2 days before my birthday. Just wait until Arlo's out of the way. The paperwork's ready. And here's another. He won't fight. He never does. Camille's face blanched. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Bryce shifted, blinking like someone trying to wake up from a nightmare that had turned real. Those were taken out of context, he said quickly. That was emotional venting, not a plan. I cut him off. Then explained the sale contract. Explained the $4. $3 million you owe. Explain why you needed control of Merrick Tech by this quarter's end. Or better yet, let's talk about this. I pulled out the final page. The original Merrick Tech charter. Silas had it notarized and timestamped the previous week. I pointed to the clause. No sale, transfer, or liquidation of Merrick core division shall proceed without 96% shareholder approval, I read aloud. And as it stands, between Silas Merrick's 26% and my 70%, that requirement is met, without you. Silence fell over the room like a sheet of lead. I turned toward the board. You were misled. You were nearly manipulated into approving a hostile takeover disguised as leadership transition. This company isn't just numbers on a balance sheet. It's legacy. It's technology that powers homes, that reduces waste, that improves lives. And they were ready to gut it for a payout. One of the board members, a sharp-tongued woman named Lydia who had been with us since the early days, looked at Bryce. Do you deny the contract with Nadari exists? Bryce hesitated. It wasn't final. Do you deny Camille was involved? Another member asked. Camille finally found her voice. I thought it was just a contingency plan, she said quietly. I didn't know the full scope. I shook my head. You knew enough. And you said nothing. Lydia closed her folder. I've heard enough. Within the hour, the board voted unanimously to uphold the transfer of control to me, confirm Silas's clauses as binding, and reject Bryce's appointment. But it didn't stop there. By the end of the meeting, a formal ban was issued. Bryce Voss was prohibited from entering any Merrick Tech property or accessing any system files indefinitely. Camille's name was removed from all auxiliary strategy panels, and the motion to dissolve her advisory privileges passed without a single objection. I reached into my folio once more, pulled out a final envelope, and slid it across the table toward Camille. Divorce papers. She didn't touch them. She just stared at them, eyes wet but empty. You told me to leave your daughter's life, I said, turning to Maureen. So I did. Two security officers entered quietly and stood behind Bryce and Camille. They didn't resist. Bryce kept his head high, but his hands trembled. Camille moved slowly, deliberately, like she was walking out of a dream she wasn't ready to end. As the doors closed behind them, I exhaled for the first time in hours. The room smelled of toner and citrus cleaner. But to me, it smelled like freedom. Silas was right. They came for a kingdom, but I came with fire. I stood in the stillness of the boardroom long after the others had filed out. The chairs were askew, some still bearing the weight of the confrontation, and the sunlight bleeding through the windows painted sharp angles across the hardwood floor. It was done. The documents had been filed, the ban was formal, and Bryce Voss, the would-be usurper, was nothing more than a disgraced footnote. I should have felt triumphant. I should have been satisfied. But all I felt was a strange, hollow quiet, like the wind had been knocked out of me, only I hadn't realized it until the silence rushed in. Security escorted Bryce and Camille out of the building minutes after the vote. I didn't watch it happen. I didn't need to. I'd already seen the truth of who they were and what they'd chosen. The betrayal had been calculated, precise. Not a crime of passion but of ambition, of greed, of entitlement. The kind that doesn't just stab, it twists. But it was Camille's face I couldn't get out of my mind. When I handed her the envelope, divorce papers neatly stacked, signed, notarized, her hand didn't even move toward it. Her mouth parted, like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Maybe she couldn't. Or maybe she finally understood that this was the part where words no longer mattered. No apology could rewrite what she'd signed her name to. She had chosen Bryce's survival over my dignity, Nadari's money over our marriage, and silence over truth. I wasn't the man she wanted anymore. Or maybe I never was. Maybe I was just the bridge she'd needed to cross, and then burn. The elevator ride down was quiet. Renata walked with me to the lobby, her expression unreadable. You okay? She finally asked. I gave a hollow laugh. I think I've aged a decade in the last week. She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. You did what most people wouldn't. You held the line. You protected what mattered. I lost a marriage in the process, I said. Renata shook her head. No. You found out what your marriage was made of. That's not a loss. That's clarity. She hugged me, brief and fierce, and then left me alone with the echoes of my own choices. I didn't go back to the office. I didn't go to the estate. I drove until I hit the coast, parked by the water, and sat on a bench while the waves rolled in like they had all the answers. My phone buzzed 3 times. Camille. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not because I hated her, but because I didn't recognize her anymore. The woman I'd married would have stood by me. The woman I'd married would have looked me in the eye and told me the truth before letting her brother get everything we built. I scrolled through the photos on my phone. The old ones. Her laughing in that cafe in Prague. Us tangled up on the couch with takeout containers and codes scribbled on napkins. Late nights building the first prototype in our garage apartment. Her hands covered in paint because she insisted the branding mattered just as much as the engine beneath it. We had been a team once, or so I thought, but somewhere along the way, I became the scaffolding for her ambitions. And once her tower was tall enough, she didn't need the structure anymore. Later that evening, I returned to the estate for the last time. Not to reconcile, to pack. I moved through the house like a ghost, pulling shirts from hangers, loading my laptop, chargers, notebooks. I didn't touch the wedding photos. I didn't need souvenirs. The memories were burned into me, both the beautiful and the brutal. Camille wasn't home, or if she was, she stayed hidden. I found a note on the kitchen counter, written in her delicate handwriting. Arlo, I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I was protecting you from the board, from Bryce, from yourself. I didn't know how to stop it once it started. I know I've lost you. I know I deserve that. But I want you to know, I did love you. Still do. Camille, I read it twice. Then folded it and left it where I found it. Some confessions come too late. Some wounds close around the blade, not after it's removed, but while it's still twisting. Before leaving, I stopped by the study. The bookshelves still smelled like old paper and sandalwood. On the desk, framed under glass, was the original company mission statement, the one I wrote and Camille helped polish. We don't build for ego. We build for impact. I stared at it for a long time, then turned and walked out. I didn't take the Maserati or the Range Rover. I left both behind. I climbed into my old hybrid, the one I used to drive before Merrick Tech exploded in valuation. The one Camille used to tease me about. "You still drive that tin can?" she used to say. "You're a CEO now." Not anymore. I wasn't a husband. I wasn't her trophy. I wasn't their placeholder. I was Arlo Merrick, majority owner, son of grit, grandson of a builder. That night, I checked into a modest two-bedroom apartment downtown, the kind with a brick wall in the kitchen and pipes you could hear breathing at night. I ordered Thai food from the place around the corner, cracked open a beer, and sat on the floor surrounded by boxes of books, hard drives, and sketches for the Lighthouse Initiative. I had my company. I had my clarity. I had my name. And in exile, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. I thought about Bryce and Camille, probably scrambling for damage control, hiring lawyers, spinning stories. But it didn't matter. The board had seen the truth. Investors had already started to reach out with support. Nadari was backing away, slowly but visibly. He didn't like exposure. He preferred shadows. And we dragged him straight into the spotlight. Let them stew in the consequences. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was chasing legacy, and they were no longer part of mine. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the work like a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. Grief is a strange fuel. It burns clean when you've already burned through the tears, through the disbelief, through the echoing question of how could they. By the time I returned to Merrick Tech in full, the ashes of betrayal had settled into something cold and solid in my chest, a foundation. I started every morning before sunrise, arriving at headquarters while the janitorial staff was still emptying bins and mopping floors. I needed the quiet. I needed the place to breathe again without the ghosts of Bryce's ambition or Camille's silences. My first move was to reinstate Renata as Chief Innovation Officer. No more acting roles, no more temporary titles. She'd been the heart of our R&D division since the first sketches of the Lighthouse Initiative, and she was the only person I trusted to help turn Merrick Tech from a bleeding vessel into a streamlined engine again. Our first real meeting happened on a Sunday morning. Renata showed up in jeans and a flannel, her curls tied up in a messy bun, coffee in one hand, her laptop in the other. "We're not just recovering," I told her as we stood in the old war room. "We're reimagining. I don't want us crawling back to where we were. I want to launch us forward." She nodded. "Then we need Lighthouse." Lighthouse was our moonshot, an autonomous renewable energy system designed to integrate solar, geothermal, and wind energy into a single adaptive platform. It was ahead of its time. When we first proposed it to the board a year ago, they called it ambitious, which was a polite way of saying too expensive and too risky. But now, with the company's leadership finally clear and the shadows lifted, we had nothing but space and reason to push forward. I greenlit the prototype phase that same week. We dusted off old designs, called in former team members who had left during the chaos, and rebuilt our engineering hub into a hive of innovation. It was messy, fast, and relentless. Days bled into nights. Meals were skipped. Arguments broke out over power grids and microfusion cells, and whether the AI interface should have a voice or just a visual display. I loved every second of it. The board was cautious. Investors were skeptical. But I gave them something they hadn't seen in months: direction. I brought them into the labs, let them see the simulations. I showed them the numbers, the clean pathways to long-term profitability, and the impact projections that proved Lighthouse could reduce reliance on fossil fuels in small cities by 68% within 3 years. This isn't just innovation, I told them during our second quarter meeting. It's relevance. If we don't lead, we follow. And Merrick Tech was never built to follow. That line made headlines. It also brought back an old spark in their eyes. The kind we had in the beginning, when the company still felt like a mission, not a brand. 3 months in, we launched the first working prototype on-site. It powered a segment of the Merrick campus for 12 straight days without a single drop of external energy. Reporters came. Environmental coalitions called. Government contracts began circling. The air in the office changed. Hope returned. At the press event, I wore a simple gray jacket and no tie. No suits. No performative power. Just presence. Silas came too. He walked slower now. Needed help getting up the stairs to the platform. But when he stood beside me, gripping the rail with one hand and nodding to the crowd with that familiar glint in his eye, I knew this wasn't just a product launch. It was a statement. We built this from ruin, I said into the mic, not because we wanted revenge, but because we wanted to remember what it felt like to matter. The applause came like a wave. After the cameras stopped flashing and the officials started mingling, Silas remained by my side. He looked out over the crowd, then back at the sleek metal tower pulsing silently behind us, the lighthouse core, humming with clean, intelligent energy. You've done it, he said, his hand resting firm on mine. You turned betrayal into brilliance. I didn't do it alone, I replied. You didn't have to, he said. You just had to make sure the people worth keeping had room to build. We sat on a bench near the installation while the crowd dispersed. I watched employees take photos with their families. Kids ran across the lawn in front of the lighthouse display, pointing up like it was a spaceship. It struck me then what legacy really means. It's not a name on a building. It's not a logo on a stock ticker. It's a direction, a standard. It's what you choose to protect when you have nothing left but the will to keep going. And it can't be bought or sold or handed off like a favor at a cocktail party. It has to be earned. That night, I returned to my downtown apartment for the first time in days. I walked past the cardboard boxes still half unpacked, dropped my keys in the ceramic dish I made in 8th grade art class, and sat down at the small kitchen table with a glass of whiskey. My phone buzzed again. Camille. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. Whatever apology she had, whatever excuse or explanation, it couldn't stand in the same room as what we'd built in those past 3 months. I wasn't that man anymore, the one who lived for her approval, who bit his tongue when Bryce laughed in his face, who accepted a seat at their table like it was some kind of gift. I had my own table now, and everyone sitting at it had earned their place. The Lighthouse Initiative would go on to change everything. Our stock soared, our competitors scrambled, and the press called it a Merrick Renaissance. But I didn't care about the headlines. I cared about the lab lights staying on at midnight, about engineers arguing over possibilities, not limitations, about the quiet nod my grandfather gave me after the room emptied. That was the real rebuild, not just a company, but myself. The letter came on a Tuesday, handwritten. Cream-colored paper, her signature perfume faint but unmistakable on the envelope seal. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the table beside my laptop, beside the specs for Lighthouse's next expansion phase, beside the only things that truly needed my attention now. But I kept glancing at it between emails, as if the thing might whisper if I stared long enough. Camille hadn't called in over 2 weeks. The last time she did, I let it ring out. She left a message that I never played. Then came this letter, breaking the silence not with noise, but with intimacy. The kind of quiet that forces you to listen. I read it just after midnight, sitting alone in the kitchen of my modest apartment while the hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Her handwriting had always been elegant, rounded, almost too perfect, like everything else about her. The letter was long, for pages. The first 2 were memories, her version of us, as if nostalgia might cushion what came next. She said she missed who I was before Merrick Tech became everything. Before the boardrooms, before the investors, before the title. She said she remembered ramen on the fire escape, and how I used to fall asleep mid-sentence because I was so excited about code that I forgot to breathe. She said she never stopped loving me, but admitted, finally, that somewhere along the way, love turned into strategy. I thought it was harmless positioning, she wrote. I never thought Bryce would go that far. I never meant to lose you. What she never wrote, not once, was I'm sorry. And I realized that was the clearest truth in the whole thing. Camille didn't want forgiveness. She wanted to be remembered as misunderstood, not as complicit. She wanted to crawl back into a softer version of the past, where intentions mattered more than actions. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with no label. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but because some things are better buried than burned. The next day, I visited the vineyard estate for the first time since leaving it behind. Not for Camille, for Grandpa. Silas had taken a turn. He wasn't sick exactly, just slowing down in a way that couldn't be reversed. The strong voice that used to echo through boardrooms now came in dry, careful syllables. But his eyes were sharp. Always his eyes. He was seated in his sunroom, the one with a view of the hills where he used to walk every morning before the arthritis took that from him. I sat beside him in silence, letting him finish his tea before speaking. "I got a letter," I said. He raised a brow. "From her?" I nodded. "For pages. Said she misses who I was." He smiled faintly. "People always miss the version of you that served them best." I let that sit between us. Then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I thought I'd feel more. When she left, when Bryce fell, when the board voted, I thought it would feel like winning. Silas's hand closed over mine. "Fragile, but warm. That's because you were never playing their game. You weren't fighting for victory. You were fighting to remember who you were when everything's stripped away." He paused. "And that man is still here. Still building." We sat there for an hour, watching the sun trace golden lines across the vineyard. I told him about the second lighthouse unit being installed in Denver, about the government's interest in scaling the platform for mid-sized municipalities, about the interns who reminded me of myself at 22, all caffeine and conviction. He listened, nodding, his thumb occasionally tapping the armrest like he was still conducting meetings in his mind. "I won't be around forever," he said finally. "And I'm glad for that. Because when I go, I'll know the company isn't in hands that just want to preserve it. It's in hands that will evolve it." I blinked, swallowing the lump that had formed in my throat. "You still have time." He looked at me then, not with pity, but with certainty. "Time is a tide, Arlo. You can't stop it. But you can choose what gets pulled under and what floats." Later that night, I walked the property alone, past the gardens Camille had once redesigned with a landscape architect she barely let me meet, past the fountain where we toasted our first big funding round, past the guest house where Bryce had stayed for 3 months while figuring things out. The silence didn't haunt me. It comforted me. This place was never really mine. I was just passing through. The Merrick name was on the gates, but the house was built for another life, one I no longer needed to chase. On my way back to the car, I paused by the gate and looked one last time at the estate. There were no ghosts, no regrets, just ashes. Camille tried again the following week. Through mutual friends, then through one of her old law school classmates who was now trying to connect, as if we were all part of the same polite circle again. I didn't respond. I wasn't angry anymore. I just had nothing left to offer that version of the world. Maureen's law firm began to quietly lose clients. Word of the board scandal had trickled into the professional circuit, and in Silicon Valley, reputation was a currency. The Voss name, once printed in event brochures and glossy features, was quietly erased from donor lists and PR rosters. Bryce? He resurfaced in Nevada, of all places, selling mid-range luxury cars. A man who once stood in a Merrick tech boardroom, now pitching zero-down leases to accountants and golf dads. Fitting, really. He always could sell an illusion. As for me, I built a new home, not sprawling, not high-walled and manicured, but modest, efficient, clean. There were no marble staircases, no curated wine cellars, just a home office with whiteboards lining the walls, a small garden I watered myself, and a team of people I trusted checking in every morning through calls and messages that buzzed with energy, not anxiety. One night, I sat outside under string lights I'd hung myself, sipping tea as the latest lighthouse status report loaded on my tablet. The projections were beyond even our optimistic scenarios. We weren't just recovering. We were leading. And not just in business. In vision. That's when I finally understood what Silas had meant. Legacy isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with press releases or victory laps. It lives in the silence after the storm, the stillness after the fire. It lives in who you are when no one's watching. And in that quiet, I felt something better than closure. I felt peace. It's been a year since the night Bryce tried to take what he could never earn and Camille showed me what silence really means. 1 year since the wine glasses clinked under chandeliers and everyone smiled for photos while plotting behind my back. 1 year since I was told to leave a life I'd helped build. And yet, I've never felt more at home. Merrick Tech didn't just survive. It ascended. The Lighthouse Initiative, once dismissed as too ambitious, became the cornerstone of a national infrastructure pivot. We installed systems in 5 states, with 2 more under contract. Municipalities now rely on the adaptive grid we developed, a fusion of solar, wind, and geothermal intelligence that balances itself in real time. Our tech didn't just perform. It led. It saved. The valuation of the company tripled. But that was the least of it. We were invited to the Global Climate Innovation Summit in Geneva. Our case study headlined a national clean energy policy briefing. Schools began integrating Lighthouse into their STEM curriculum. Renata, now featured on magazine covers, said during one of her interviews, "We're not inventing the future. We're simply refusing to repeat the past." And as for me, they started calling me the builder. At first, I resisted it. It sounded dramatic, a little mythic. But after a while, I understood what it meant. Not the man who imagined everything. Not the face that flashed on covers. But the one who carried brick after brick when everyone else left the job site. The one who stayed when others schemed. Who learned the wiring. Who traced the blueprints not for glamour, but because he couldn't sleep if a system didn't work right. The office I sit in now isn't the glass tower Camille helped decorate. It's a steel and glass hybrid structure just north of the original Merrick site. Designed for sunlight, for air, for collaboration. The walls are white boards. There's no corner office, just open flow. But they still gave me a private space, tucked behind a living wall of vertical plants. From here, I can see the entire floor. People moving, building, solving. There's a rhythm to it. It's the sound of legacy continuing. Silas visits once a week now. He's thinner, slower. His hands tremble sometimes when he buttons his coat. But his voice? Still razor sharp. Every Thursday, we have lunch together on the terrace. Just sandwiches and ginger tea. Sometimes we talk about work. Sometimes we sit in silence and watch the interns below argue over circuit diagrams. He always grins when they get loud. Means they care, he says. Only fools stay quiet when the future's on the line. Last Thursday, he brought something with him. An old, faded envelope. He slid it across the table without ceremony. "I found this while cleaning out my desk," he said. "You should have it." I opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 15 years ago, addressed to me. It was written after I graduated, when I was about to move to the city for my first big job. Back then, I didn't take his offer to join Merrick Tech right away. I wanted to prove I could succeed without the Merrick name. I thought it would make me stronger. The letter began, "Arlo, I respect that you're leaving, that you need to carve something of your own. But I want you to know, legacy isn't just about being handed something. It's about what you do when no one's watching. It's about how you rebuild when they try to take it from you. If you ever come back, Merrick won't be a gift. It will be a tool, a forge, and I hope by then, you'll know how to hold the fire." I sat back, the letter trembling slightly in my fingers. I looked at Silas, whose eyes were wet but steady. "You knew?" I said. He nodded. "I knew they'd come for it one day. Maybe not Bryce. Maybe someone else. But I knew they'd see the shine and think they were owed it." "And you waited for me to earn it." He looked out at the campus. "I didn't wait. I watched. I saw you choose character over applause. I saw you build when no one was clapping. I saw you walk away from the house and the woman and the lie. That wasn't waiting, son. That was becoming." We sat in silence for a while after that. Just two Merricks watching a company buzz with life. Later that afternoon, I walked the halls alone. I passed meeting rooms filled with sketches and data models and passion. No one looked up when I passed. No nervous nods. No performative deference. Just work. Just momentum. I passed the commemorative wall we'd recently installed. A digital archive of Merrick Tech's milestones. My name was there. So was Renata's. So was Silas's, of course. But the wall didn't feel like an award. It felt like a reminder that everything worth building comes with the weight of keeping it upright. And as I turned the corner, I saw a small framed photo hanging near the break area. Someone had tacked it up without permission. It was from our first lighthouse field test. A group shot, all of us in safety vests, arms slung over each other's shoulders, exhausted and smiling. I'd forgotten about that moment. I smiled. Later that night, I returned to the house I now called home. A modern craftsman build with just enough room for peace, for thought, for family when I'm ready. I parked the hybrid in the garage, stepped inside, and set my things down. I turned off my phone, sat on the back patio, watched the sky turn amber, and I thought about what people think legacy is. They think it's money, property, control, but it isn't. The real inheritance isn't something someone gives you. It's what they see in you before you see it in yourself. It's what they prepare you for in silence. It's the resilience forged in late nights and early mornings and heartbreaks that don't stop your heart. Silas lit the match, but I carried the fire. And now, as I look out over everything they tried to take from me, I don't feel bitterness. I feel gratitude. Not for the betrayal, but for the chance to rebuild. Not for the title, but for the trust. And not for the name, but for the man I became under its weight. They tried to replace me. Instead, they forged me. And I'll carry that forward, one system, one city, one impossible vision at a time. Because I know now, legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you ignite.